Egypt, the land of pharaohs, the breadbasket of empires, and one of the greatest civilizations in history. However, since the Ayyubid Caliphate in the 1100s, it's always been the bridesmaid and never the bride. While Egypt would remain independent under the Mamluks until the 1500s, they would never reach the heights of true medieval or modern power. Ottoman rule would be supplanted by a modern sultanate that quickly became little more than a British vassal, only to now be a middling republic. Modern Egypt has undergone massive changes, but it has always survived. But during the early days of the modern sultanate, it came this close to regaining its greatness and supplanting the Turks as the premier Middle Eastern power. So, what if it had? What if Egypt was a great power? Our story starts with Muhammad Ali, no, not that one, the Ottoman governor of Egypt. The French withdrawal from Egypt following Napoleon's defeat left a power vacuum that allowed Ali to insert himself between the central government of the Ottomans and the traditional Mamluk aristocracy. Winning this power struggle, he had two goals: assert his position as the head of an Egyptian monarchy and ensure its independence. Thus, he would spend the next several years modernizing the statelet, nationalization of land and revenue, and using the investments to modernize the army and navy, as well as conquests in Arabia and Sudan. However, here we come to our first mistake. In 1825, in exchange for lands in Syria, Crete, and southern Greece, the Pasha would align himself one final time with the Ottomans during the Greek War of Independence. Not only did this aggravate France, Britain, and Russia, who had largely decided that white people were allowed to be free, no, not Poland or Ireland, that would be silly, it would be a waste of resources for land that failed to materialize. This would be the backdrop for the First Turco-Egyptian War, and there's our point of divergence. Muhammad Ali betrays the Ottomans at the first opportunity and declares intent to sit out the conflict. This forces the Turks to consider Egypt as an enemy, since governors aren't supposed to do that, while giving Egypt a good look diplomatically. The reason that Ali goes this route as opposed to simply declaring independence is that I don't think he would want to embolden nationalism by openly aligning with the Greeks. Alright, so the Egyptian-Turkish War kicks off in 1826. Now what? Well, we know that Egypt would have a better army than the Ottomans at this point, in addition to being on the side of the British and Russian powers. Meaning, yeah, the Ottomans aren't going to do so great. However, neither the Russians or British actually wanted the downfall of the Ottoman Empire at this point, both preferring to keep it whole enough that the other couldn't carve it up. As a result, while Egypt does get serious several years earlier and Ali likely becomes hereditary ruler, it does not actually gain de jure independence, at least not yet, in a similar vein to our timeline. However, this is also nearly the exact situation that drove the Second Turco-Egyptian War, but now Ali has the actual good graces of European powers. This actually mostly applies to Britain and potentially Russia, since during the actual Egyptian-Turkish Wars, France quickly came to see Ali as the best way to grow their influence in the Middle East, which I suspect would already be the case in this time period. While originally I would have expected Russia to be Ali's ally of choice, after doing some research I realized that Russia has not only their British rivals to worry about, but the dismemberment of the Turks without the approval of their Austrian ally would have been awful diplomatically. Thus, I'll have Ali use his positive image from the last war to push for the support of France and Britain. They wouldn't be allies, but they would recognize Egyptian independence in the event of a war of Turkish aggression, which of course they do not believe will happen anytime soon. So let's have a war of Turkish aggression. The Ottomans invaded Syria a mere 6 years after the First War, and I could see them desperately pushing for it here as well, even if it's early. 1832 to 1834 would be the range I would expect. As a result, Ali declares independence and lays out some war aims. Russia, of course, would be concerned about their Balkan plans and the collapse of their favorite punching bag, and so would attempt to call a conference to reinstitute the status quo. However, unlike before, when Britain saw the Turks as mostly reasonable and was concerned about Egypt's impact on the balance of power, now they see Egypt as a fairly viable partner in the region. Thus, even if Russia is able to corral this conference together, they likely aren't able to convince the other powers to force Ali to stand down. They likely support the Ottomans in a battle akin to our timeline, but ultimately it doesn't matter too much to the diplomatic situation. Now, in the real Second Turco-Egyptian War, Ali had gotten it into his head to depose the Ottoman Sultan and place a puppet child on the throne. This, I think, would be too far for Britain or France to support. Any gains are kept to Arabia, the absolute borders of Anatolia, and possibly Crete. I don't know why Crete keeps coming up when Cyprus would be a much more strategic choice, but that's what Ali kept doing every time. Alright, so Ali's got his empire, he's got his hereditary rule. Now what? Well, he's in a much better place diplomatically. In our timeline, Muhammad Ali was not the man who actually obtained Egyptian independence on paper, and spent the rest of his rule as a powerful but restricted vassal, which obviously doesn't happen here. I would expect the next 10 years to be focused on continual economic growth. Through his nationalization, the Egyptian government made a lot of money, as well as taxes on the emergent industrialization. Though this still wasn't enough to cover everything, although at least this time he doesn't have to build 2 fleets from scratch. There are likely campaigns to assimilate Syria more fully. They and the Arabs of Hejaz had launched revolts in our timeline, though they were crushed, and they would be here as well. I could also see some invasion of Yemen so as to bring control over the Red Sea, but this might anger Britain a little too early. Without the weakening of its power and economy, Egypt's industrialization will also go much better, helping modernize the state further. In addition, they will be able to make plenty of money selling cotton to Europe, which will probably help in a few decades. However, diplomatically, Egypt's early independence will be rather awkward. They'll be pro-France and Britain, but both of those powers are trying to exploit the region, which Ali does not want because he wants to exploit the region. In addition, with the collapse of Ottoman power in both the Balkans and the Middle East, being reduced to Turkey and whatever bits of Iraq they can keep, Egypt will take over most of their diplomatic standing and obligations. And unfortunately for Egypt, in our world, Muhammad Ali would tragically spend the late 1830s and early 1840s falling increasingly senile, and his son Ibrahim would take over most government duties, sadly dying 8 months into this rule. The Pasha would not be notified of this due to the deterioration of his mental state. Worst of all, Ibrahim's nephew, Abbas, came to power. Abbas was a noted reactionary and undid many of his grandfather's reforms as possible, ending the monopolies, closing state-affiliated factories and schools, and withdrawing to a secluded life. This meant that his successor, Said, who was far from perfect, had a harder time ruling. We'll have it be that Ibrahim recruits his brother Said into his administration as early as possible, leaving him able to secure power instead of his nephew. Or Abbas just refuses the crown and gives it to Said. While not perfect, being a lover of extravagant dinners and parties, Said would keep up the modernization of his state, including a national bank and railroad. Said comes to power decades earlier and is able to keep the pace of modernization without Abbas's reactionary ideals or the subsequent hostility from the West. He would also be rather openly pro-French, having grown up a friend of their consul's son and educated in Paris, though we should probably tone down the partying just to make sure. Thus, in this world, France is the European benefactor of the Suez Canal as opposed to Britain. However, here, Egypt is at least able to actually benefit from the canal due to owning the Red Sea shore, southern Yemen, and actually being independent. This also means that when his nephew Ismail comes to power in the 1860s, even he couldn't actually bankrupt the state. In fact, let's jump ahead to the 1860s. On the world stage, Egypt is a middling power and ally to France, with designs on Arabia, North and East Africa, and plans to end the Ottoman Empire. Ismail inherits the state after his uncle passes away and launches yet another wave of reforms. Telegram lines, Suez canals, agricultural modernization, army reforms, everything you can think of. In our world, the bribes to the Turks to allow this and a war with Ethiopia were all so expensive, on top of the reforms themselves, that it led to the end of Egyptian independence and the British occupation. Here, since Egypt was doing better when Ismail got the job and doesn't have to bribe Turkey, that part is sorted. The war with Ethiopia likely goes better, but probably doesn't end with the total conquest of the state. Likely just the conquest of Eritrea, though that's still very expensive. However, Egypt still isn't seen as a great power, just a decent-sized B tier. So how do we get it there? Well, I could see Egypt and Russia having a lot of tension. Firstly, Russia sees Egypt as a threat to their Mediterranean access, especially an expansionist Egypt that would likely want to contest the Middle East. In addition, Russia has to deal with the fact that Egypt is a threat to the Ottomans and is decidedly pro-Western. As a result, if Ismail attempts to take over the rest of Iraq or part of southern Anatolia, it could well be a crisis that evolves into a Russo-Egyptian war. Given that this is Russia in the 1860s, still in the midst of a complete army overhaul from the Crimean War, I could easily see Egypt holding and gaining northern Iraq and southern Turkey. This would be what pushes Egypt into the big dogs militarily and diplomatically, similar to Japan a little ways down the road. While in our timeline, the Japanese victory over Russia was a diplomatic gain that allowed the overextended empire to gain a valuable British ally, this isn't what would bear out. While yes, it would be prestigious and garner British attention, Egypt is a region that the British would increasingly want to dominate. The Suez Canal and access to it is becoming an increasing priority for Britain, and Egypt's chief ally in the West, France, might be friendly now, but that's not something Britain can count on. As a result, there will be a lot of tension. British Malta and Ionia will become some of the most fortified places in the Mediterranean as the Egyptian fleet grows into a powerhouse in the region. Ismail viewed Egypt as not only African, but European, and that was in our timeline. Here, that's even more true, and Egypt will expect, and often receive, a place at the table for these international conferences in the place of the Ottomans. However, they do seriously need to be careful in the aftermath of the Russo-Egyptian War, or they will default on their debts and being forced into the British or French sphere of influence. Ismail would also oversee the transition to a more modern political culture in Egypt, albeit somewhat incidentally. I could see Egypt starting to promote some kind of pan-Arabism to stabilize their empire and leaning on this notion to legitimize their interests in the Muslim world diplomatically. They already control most Arabic-speaking lands from Tripoli to Mashriq, after all. I don't know if Egypt would claim the caliphate from the Ottomans. That might be too great an insult, or spiritually damning. But if they wanted to, I think they could. Also, interestingly in our timeline, Ishmael established a Council of Delegates in 1866. While it was supposed to be an advisory board, it quickly became increasingly powerful, and the rural landowners that dominated the council managed to get him to restore major tax privileges. While I don't necessarily think this would immediately evolve into an Egyptian parliament, I do think that it could. However, the 1870s to 1880s will be complicated for Egypt. With France losing the Franco-Prussian War, their major ally has been discredited, and likely wants its money back. This will force Egypt to scrap a lot of the monopolization that has worked so well for it, likely pushing to a more economically liberal mindset. Now, something to keep in mind is that Egyptian independence will have huge ramifications for the Berlin Conference and the Scramble for Africa, not only because Egypt will be a party to that conference, and have claims of its own, but because Britain has no way to demand a vertical linking of colonies. In our world, their control over Egypt and South Africa meant they basically got to control both ends of the continent and just needed to fill in the middle, even screwing over Portugal for this end, and countless natives. Only exception was German East Africa, and they made damn sure they got that after World War I. Here, not only do they control Egypt, but Egypt will likely control Eritrea, meaning that they flank the entire Red Sea. This alone dramatically changes the scramble for Africa, and honestly, the map can kind of be anything. However, there are still some things to note. Most colonial powers wanted east-west corridors to Asia through their African possessions. Britain was weird for going the way they did, they just happened to rule the planet and the two most important parts of Africa for that aim. As a result, I think we'd see a couple of these east-west plans go through successfully. In this case, Portugal and Germany. Though obviously not the whole Congo for Germany. Just a little nibble from Leopold's domains. Portugal and Germany were the closest to this goal in our timeline, and France's only path towards it requires the Sudan, which isn't going to happen. Hell, I could even see Egypt supporting Germany here just to prevent Britain from controlling a longer border against them. However, one thing I do think is nearly inevitable is that Britain takes over Somalia in this world, just so they can at least contest the Red Sea. I can't say how well any subsequent wars with Ethiopia go, but that would be a problem for Britain. Egypt itself wouldn't necessarily need much from the Berlin Conference, already controlling most of the northeastern continent and the Red Sea. What they really need is allies and legitimacy, which the conference would give them. Now, this is officially when we lose all historical precedent. Ishmael would control a succession in this timeline as opposed to being deposed in favor of his son Tufik. In addition, Egypt has spent the last 50 years undergoing major economic changes that would promote a higher literacy rate, standard of living, and economic output. With Ishmael's Council of Delegates, I could easily see the rise of constitutionalist pressures within the country, especially as people become more and more educated and professionalized. Now, I have no clue what the politics would be like beyond a surface level, but I'd expect the rural agriculturalists and conservatives, those in favor of the nationalized monopolies, and more liberal economic theories would be the main drivers of debate during the early years. Anything more concrete is fundamentally impossible to predict, though. Throughout the 1870s, there would be a lot of tension between Egypt, Russia, and Britain. While Egypt controls the Red Sea and has a respectable Mediterranean presence, Britain still wants to get their grubby little mitts all over the Suez Canal, and probably doesn't like the powerful army that Egypt has right by several smaller British possessions like Somalia, South Arabia, and God forbid they ever make it out of the Persian Gulf to threaten India. In contrast, the Russo-Egyptian War would leave Turkey as little more than a Russian protectorate, further upsetting Britain, while they each have differing ideas for Anatolia, the Caucasus, and potentially Iran. Not to mention, Egypt likely has a messy relationship with Greece, one of Russia's little buddies. So, as the 19th century rolls on, Egypt has to make a choice. Does it align itself with an old friend in the French Entente, which would put it with its two fiercest rivals, and Italy, who probably wants Libya, I guess? Or they can approach the Germans, who increasingly grow to challenge Britain and Russia, already humiliated the French in the last war, and have no territorial conflicts with Egypt. You know, that's not really a hard choice. Also make a note that Egypt started drilling for oil as early as the 1880s. In this timeline, that means Egypt has a strong, robust industrial state when it discovers this major natural resource, and it will be able to exploit it eagerly, for domestic matters and for war. So, here's the thing. It's very hard to predict how World War I goes. While Austria might have still occupied Bosnia in the aftermath of the collapse of the Ottomans, that means that it took the region over a decade earlier, which could easily butterfly the R&G fest that was the Franz Ferdinand assassination. But it wouldn't be a video about the 19th century if I didn't at least try to touch on it. So for the sake of this scenario, We'll say that Ferdinand still gets got during a trip, but that the assassination is much less comedic in retrospect. Maybe the bombs work or something like that. During the July crisis, the Egyptian government will be highly sympathetic toward the Austrian situation, and their monarchs likely knew each other. However, soon it will be clear that war is coming and Egypt must choose its path. The Entente is not an option due to the long-standing animosity with Russia and Britain, but the Central Powers are also distant. Thus, in August 1914, the Egyptian government closes the Suez Canal to all warring nations. However, the British Empire's power comes from their territory east of Suez, and France also does have Indochina. They're much more impacted than the Central Powers are. In addition, Egypt does not control the entire canal, as it only has shares in a company also owned by Brits and Frenchmen. Thus, the British and French demand Egypt open the canal. Egypt stands firm, and the British and French declare war by September. Sorry for the quick interruption, but if you like the video so far, please do consider subscribing for new alternate history content every week. Now, let's split the timeline in two from here. One where the Egyptians and Central Powers win, and one where they lose. We'll start with the latter since it's somewhat simpler and we know roughly what would be at stake. In this scenario, the Nile Empire is beset by the Royal Navy and French fleet, massacring the Mediterranean fleet. At the same time, the Ottoman Sultanate, practically a Russian puppet state at this point, is forced to allow Russian troops through, resulting in trench warfare in Syria. In addition, over the course of 1915, the Red Sea Fleet is severely weakened by the Royal Navy. Thus, under Winston Churchill, a large number of Australian and New Zealand soldiers are charged with taking the Suez Canal, which they do in 1916. This is a death knell for Egypt. While the soldiers in the eastern half of the country are able to hold for a long time, at least a year, Egypt cannot replace any soldiers they lose, at least not from the Nile-based corps, and conscripts from the Arabian possessions are going to be ripe for dissertation. The Egyptian war effort would collapse in 1917, and the peace treaty would be brutal. The loss of not only the Suez Canal and their Arabian Empire, but Eritrea and Libya, as well as war reparation. The actual borders are up for the debate, but for the sake of argument, I had Britain take Iraq, Yemen, the Canal, and prop up an ally in Hejaz, while France gets Eritrea and Syria. Italy likely gets most of Libya, so they can feel like they helped. Russia, who wouldn't collapse into the revolution at this point without the price of food skyrocketing, expands their puppet Ottomans. For the record, I give the Tsar up until 1920. This would be bad. Bad news for the Egyptian government. With the loss of their empire, they will feel the economic ramifications of the treaty even harder than they expect, and the government would take the blame. Between reparations, the loss of their prime economic edge, and the recession from mobilizing an overheated army, the economy will suffer hard. This will result in the erosion of Egyptian democracy as people simply look for an answer, and neither the conservatives or liberals have. This could go any number of ways, but I suspect they'll go toward the right, which will promise revenge against the foreign West and a return to the golden age of Ali, as well as Pan-Arabism. The subsequent conflict sees Egypt form a fourth pillar of the Axis, or third, I suppose. As a result, after the collapse of France, Egypt will reoccupy Syria and likely enter the war against Britain. In addition, they will likely be able to aid Italy in the Balkans, perhaps setting up a puppet regime in Turkey, which would help them supply oil to Germany. When the US joins the war, things will get very bad very quickly, as North Africa falls to the Allies and Egypt is the member of the Axis most vital to opening the Mediterranean up and resupplying the Soviets. This Egypt ends the war as a pro-American republic with all the Marshall Plan money you could dream of. But the Cold War is so dramatically different, it's impossible to assume anything. But if we jump back to 1914, we can set Egypt up to be at the victor's table. I don't think that it's possible for Egypt to surpass the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, but it's absolutely possible for them to hold the Suez. Britain would need to take over the Red Sea, and with a bit of luck, Egypt could deny them that. Which also means that any Churchillian plans of invading the Sinai from East Africa go about as well as Gallipoli did in real life. This means that Egypt can stand against the armies of Russia and only has to repel the beachheads from the British. This gives them a lot more manpower to mount their own offensives, which also sucks up Entente resources. French Djibouti largely only existed because Egypt didn't care, and they wouldn't say no to that kind of military base, and it would further cripple the operations of the French and British navies in the Red Sea. Similarly, France wouldn't be able to pull from Algeria for reinforcements, not that there were a lot of them, if Egypt is invading Tunisia and Algeria, in addition to the manpower shortages relative to our timeline. Well, maybe not shortages is the right word, but delays since the Cape is still open to the Entente. In addition, Russian logistics are going to suffer in the Syrian desert, meaning that it's only a matter of time before one of the largest armies in the Entente is broken with Egypt pouring into Turkey. When Russia collapses, if the Entente soldiers are any less than our timeline, They will mutiny and they will break, especially when Egypt starts sending Germany food and oil over land. Now, obviously, this post-war settlement is a lot harder to figure out. Europe probably goes the way of your generic German victory at this point, but Egypt's war was, for all intents and purposes, separate from the other two, a sideshow. They won, but that victory was costly in money and lives. Egypt is at the big boy table, and it's a lot more prestigious than most of Germany's other allies, but it can't claim to be on Germany's level yet. They're just as exhausted as the other powers, and likely dealing with crises in the Arabic territories. They likely take Djibouti, expand into Tunisia via their Libyan protectorate, and set up a puppet government in Turkey, but this would be straining their empire to the limits. They could maybe possibly take Cyprus, but that would require a lot of luck in the naval war and probably not even help them in the long run. The early days of the 1920s would be very rough for Egypt. While the economy wouldn't be nearly as bad as in the Entente victory, it will still enter a pretty steep recession as it demobilizes an army meant to fight some of the biggest empires on the planet. I would expect a lot of calls for internal land reform and expansion of voting rights. Hell, they might even see feminism come into vogue. And it will have moments of militancy. However, Egypt does have one massive advantage. It has oil, more than anywhere else on the planet. For context, this is the Egyptian empire in this world. In 2023, the countries that make up that empire would produce more than 20 million barrels a day. That put it well over the US's 13 million. With a democratic political system pre-war, Egypt is set up for a very bright 20th century. At least, economically. Politically, the mid-century is going to be rough. Personally, I don't think that World War II is likely in most Central Power victories, since Germany's treaties would be harsh enough that France and Russia wouldn't be able to try. However, I do think that as the German order settles, there will be a lot of regional conflicts and guerrillas. As decolonization picks up, probably later than in our timeline, Egypt will be hit hard by these conflicts that, to them, are in the core of the country and are dangerously close to major population centers. I think that Egypt could and likely would win, but it would be pretty devastating to the affected parts of the country. In addition, if Russia or Iran gets any ideas, I would expect conflict to hit the borders. However, while these are bad news, I cannot overstate how economically viable Egypt would be. It would have a diverse agricultural sector, thriving heavy industries, more oil than it could shake a stick at, and control the most important gate in the world. By the 1980s, once it's stabilized from the nationalist revolts that may or may not succeed, Egypt would easily be on Germany's level economically, diplomatically, and militarily. The only real question is what the rest of the world, like America, is up to. However, I do think I need to end the video here. At the end of either scenario, Egypt stands as a modern economic powerhouse of North Africa. However, in one, the fall of the Suez Canal stopped them from reinforcing their soldiers in the Great War and ended with the collapse of their empire, with them unable to rebuild. As a result, they were occupied by the US and turned into a powerful but reduced Republican ally in the Cold War. In the other, their narrow victories in the Red Sea keep the path to Arabia open and allow the Central Powers their victory, wherein Egypt goes on to become the premier power in the Middle East and an economic and diplomatic superpower on par with Germany and maybe even America, off a strong constitution and plenty of oil. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing for more alternate history content like it. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.